Is in turmoil. The way the world works has been turned on its head. Billions are being spent to keep the world economy afloat, and around the globe, millions of people are facing an uncertain future. But out of crisis comes perhaps an opportunity to rebuild something better. Well, tonight on Sky News, our working life after the pandemic and our new world. A very good evening, I'm Dermot Mnuchin. Now, over the course of this week, I'm speaking to some of the leading lights in the worlds of culture, politics, science, and tonight, economics. Joining us a live virtual studio audience from all around the world who will be asking questions about how we can build a new future. And I say from around the world, they're from Mexico, Ghana, Italy, Spain, Greece, Argentina, and of course, the United Kingdom. Now, facing them, we have a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, the former chief executive of BP, Lord Browne. We also have the economist Stephanie Kelton, former advisor to the US Democratic Party. And joining them, Stephen Moore, a member of President Trump's coronavirus task force for the economy. Welcome to you all. So with jobs, finance and economics now under a strain not felt for many generations, tonight we look at the future for the economy and the world of work.
There's nothing anywhere.
Aisles are empty and there's just people as far as the eye can see.
I'm a critical care nurse. I've just finished 48 hours of work. There's no fruit, there's no vegetables. Just stop it.
Consider the impact their stocking up might have on others.
This is Regent Street, home to some of the biggest names in retail, and it's almost deserted.
They're talking about the economy contracting by 35%.
That would be the biggest quarterly fall we've ever seen.
The UK is facing a significant recession.
British Airways are set to make up to 12,000 workers redundant.
Virgin Atlantic Airways is to cut more than 3,000 jobs today.
IB is shortly being put into administration.
It's all over, it's all gone. It's really sad.
It's unique in modern times. We've never seen anything like this.
For the first time in our history, the government is going to step in and help to pay people's wages.
F1 cars are out. Ventilator trolleys are in. The sheer scale and speed of what's happening here is clearly a triumph.
You feel so much more protected.
We are seeing the indomitable spirit of Britain.
Cheers.
The estate's online sales are up nearly 2,000%.
There are some fantastic ideas out there where, if we ever get over this, the world has to change.
Well, we're getting families ordering direct to the house. People have started cooking again.
I do think that the British tourism industry is going to hit the roof now.
Won't be just going back, it will be a new normal.
Well, there we have the changing way that our world is working. So let's dive in, go straight to our virtual audience gathered from all corners of the globe. And our first question tonight, that comes from Alex Liberto, who's in Rome. A very good evening to you, Alex. What would you like to ask our panel to kick us off?
Good evening. Yes, a friend of mine who was a successful businessman told me that in hindsight, he would have preferred to risk dying from the virus rather than to suffer the trauma, trepidation and degradation of certain poverty he now faces. So my question is, how can politicians and scientists come together to balance this rock and a hard place situation, considering that the efforts so far have only caused personal and social economic devastation?
Well, that really is quite a first question. Thank you very much indeed for that, Alex. Well, let's put it straight away to our panel. Very good evening to you all once again. And if I can start with you then, Professor Stiglitz, the issue, I suppose, is lockdown and all its consequences an economic price worth paying?
Oh, I think it's inevitable. Even if we didn't have the lockdown, people would be so scared of the pandemic that they're not going to be going to the theater. They're not going to be buying lots of goods. So we would have, even without the lockdown, have had a serious economic downturn. And without the lockdown, the contagion of the disease would be much worse. And the perpetuation of the disease would be much worse. And so over the long run, I think we would suffer more. The countries like New Zealand that put in place good economic policies and good health policies have been able to mitigate the adverse economic effects and have put the pandemic under control.
Stephen Moore, can I bring you in here and ask you your view on that? Did this have to be done? Did there have to be almost global lockdowns, with a few exceptions?
Well, I can really only talk about the United States, but I think that what has happened over the last 2 or 3 months in the United States will go down in history as one of the greatest economic tragedies and one of the biggest political blunders of our time. We knew at the time that there were about 13 to 15 major cities that had been impacted by coronavirus. We also knew from what was happening in China and Korea that what we all know now to be absolutely true, that this is an old person's disease, that people who had pre-existing conditions and people who were over the age of 65 were quite vulnerable. But we now know that young people are not vulnerable to this disease. So we made huge multi-trillion-dollar mistakes here. I agree with George Stiglitz that there would have been a huge impact on the economy, no question about it, if we had acted differently. But the idea of shutting down our economy was a catastrophic decision, not just for our economy, but the health effects of the coronavirus shutdown and lockdown have been arguably worse than what would have happened if we'd simply let people make their own decisions about whether to go out. And I'll make one other point. You all know that we are seeing these horrendous riots around the United States in major cities. These riots are a direct result of the lockdown. You can't keep the American people, especially young people, locked in their homes for 2 or 3 months and expect anything but this. And so I think that the kind of chaos we're seeing in American cities is a direct result of a very faulty policy of locking people in their homes.
Professor Stiglitz, just a quick rejoinder to that before I bring in our other two panelists.
I just have to respond very strongly. The protests in the United States are a result of police brutality. 50 years of police brutality, in fact, 150 years of police brutality. It is a result of a kind of brutality that has been inflamed by President Trump's vicious rhetoric. And that is the reason that our country is burning today.
OK, well, I'm going to bring, as I say, our other two panelists in a moment or two on that already, very polarised views. But I want to ask our audience, I want to put a straw poll to our audience by a show of hands, if you would. We're hearing there, one of our panellists thinks lockdown is a blunder. Another think, of course, it had to be done. So here's my question to you. Do you think the cure in the shape of the economic lockdown could prove worse than the disease itself? Hands up if you think the lockdown is worse than the virus. Well, that is just a handful, I'd say, 3 or 4. Another question for you then, audience, I'm just jotting that down. Hands up if you think that governments have generally, that have done it, if you think that governments have generally lifted lockdown too soon. Hands up if you think governments have generally lifted or started lifting their lockdowns too soon. What do you think about that? I'm saying 2/3 to 3/4 of our straw poll there. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. So let's get straight back to our panellists there. And Lord Browne, so we have people laying down their livelihoods and their jobs so that others can live. But according to our panellists, that is a price worth paying.
And I agree, it is a price worth paying to maintain the health of the vast majority of people through this lockdown. But rather than look at what could have been, I think we are where we are. And actually, we're learning a lot and we're changing a lot for the future, probably for the better. I can only speak from the point of view of business, but business is learning about different ways of doing business, more efficient, more localized, more national. There's more accelerated activity to make business more intelligent. There's a real understanding, perhaps, that nature has been a very big force here, a very big force. We don't want that to happen again. And so climate change is on the agenda still, probably reinforced. Something must be done to keep the environment, to keep us healthy. So there's many things that I think are happening here that will change the way we think about the future. And that is very important, because I think we probably couldn't have gone on the way we were going before the virus.
And to be explored a lot more deeply during the course of this next hour. But Stephanie Kelton, on that straw poll from our audience there, about 3 or 4 of them thinking that the lockdown was not a price worth paying, but 3/4 of them thinking that lockdown has been lifted too soon. Your thoughts on that, and more broadly?
Well, my first thought is that I agree completely with Professor Stiglitz that the lockdown itself is not what ultimately led consumers to withdraw from economic activity in a huge way. It was fear of the virus itself. It was fear of contracting a very contagious and lethal virus. And people would have withdrawn independent of governors or other public officials asking them to shelter in place and socially distance and so forth. So, look, I think that what we have now is a situation where we're starting to open things up, and there is a safe way to do that. And the scientists are telling us how to safely reopen this economy. And what it really requires is a great deal of testing, contact tracing, isolating people when they become infected. We know what needs to be done. We're just not executing well. And we're not anywhere near the level of testing that we need to safely begin to reopen the economy. And so once again, it is us versus the virus, and consumer psychology plays the overwhelming kind of driving force in all of this. If people don't feel safe, they're not going to re-engage fully with the economy. They're not going to go back into restaurants and bars and theaters. And so we are at a stage now where, in a very real sense, it's in our hands to determine the pace of this recovery, how quickly we can get back to, engaging with the economy in a way that's familiar to us. But until enough people feel safe going back and re-engaging, I think you're going to continue to see an economy that struggles to recover.
OK, well, let's broaden this out a bit, because we've been conducting a wide-ranging opinion poll for these programmes about the future facing the world, and it revealed some really striking insights into what the British public wants to change. Now, this is what we asked people. We asked them to consider the types of jobs people do and the different things that British companies sell and invest in. Let me take you through some of these significant results then. We asked, once the outbreak is over, how should the British economy be structured? Now, a quarter of people, precisely that, 25%, said they believe the economy should go back to being much the same as it was before. As I say, a quarter, but more than double that, 57%, said they thought the economy should be significantly different to before. And you know what? One of our studio audience has a question that relates directly to that. He's Jeremy Baker from London. Jeremy, can you put your question to the panel for us, please? And a very good evening to you.
Hi. Isn't this a perfect opportunity for us to jump straight into the new modern Britain, say goodbye to the past? I'm very worried that Rishi Sunak is spending our money on old companies and old jobs.
Well, there we are. A lot to take in there in a fairly short question from Jeremy Baker, and taking on board our poll as well. And Lord Browne, then, you were touching on it already. 57% of those polls said they thought the economy should be and would be significantly different to before. How can it be?
Well, changing economies takes a lot of time and effort. But I think, again, before the pandemic struck, there were some things going on which I think now will be accelerated. The first was to heavily invest in innovation, in smaller companies doing a lot of R&D. The government was going to, and I still think will, increase the amount of state spending on R&D by 50%, and that would mean business will follow that at least at that level, if not double that. And so there's a lot of things going on which write the future. We can't go on just investing in old companies. We have in this economy far too much concentration. For example, in aerospace and automotive, a lot of the developments for the future were taking place. They have now been cruelly shut down. So we need to diversify, we need to change the way in which we apply things. If I may say so, I think in this economy, we're great at innovating and discovering things, the science and engineering. We're not very good at retaining the companies here. We have a wonderful track record in artificial intelligence, for example. But of the 4 great companies that we invented here, they all went to American investors and to America.
But of course,
so we need to change.
Yeah, I mean, but the change all takes time. And addressing Jeremy's question directly, Stephanie Kelton, in effect, he's saying all these furlough schemes, these job retention schemes, some of them, we don't know how many yet, some of them are zombie jobs. There will be no real work to go back to.
Well, I think he's right. I mean, you know, the reality of the situation is that a large number of industries may permanently shrink. A lot of the small businesses that we are helping today may not make it on the other side. In fact, we know that they won't. Maybe as many as half of them won't be viable on the other side of this. But what do you do in the immediate term when you've got tens of millions of people whose livelihoods are tied to their jobs, and there is a way to get immediate aid to those individuals? You can't know in advance which companies are going to be successful and which won't make it on the other side. And in a crisis, speed is everything. So what the government did, I think, was the right thing, to try to help companies hold things together, to keep employees on payroll, to help these small businesses meet their recurring expenses, try to help them remain viable, so that if we get through this, then we maybe end up with fewer failed companies. But the reality is that some of the bigger industries are going to permanently change. And, the benefit is that we will have time in the months and years ahead to begin to think about how to make strategic investments and in which industries to support. But in the short term, time is everything. And getting the money out really was critically important to try to containing the collateral damage.
Well, Stephen Moore, what do you think about that? The government's role that Stephanie Kelton touched on there in choosing the jobs of the future. And what do you think they're going to be?
Well, that's the whole point, is none of us know what those industries of the future will be. A good example is, for the last 10 years, the United States of America went through the greatest oil and gas boom in the history of this country, and we became the energy powerhouse nation. Nobody in government predicted that would happen. In fact, in the midst of it, Barack Obama said we were going to, dig for the last barrel of oil in the United States in the midst of this boom. So my point is, politicians don't know what the next industry is. The people who know that and who are going to make the right decisions are private investors. We've made a lot of really, really bad decisions over the last couple of months. For example, in the United States, I can't speak for other countries, we started paying people as much or more. In fact, in 31 states now out of the 50 in the United States, people are paid more money to stay unemployed than to go on a job. Now, you don't have to be an economist to understand that's a really stupid thing to do. And now we have a big, big problem in terms of we do have our businesses back starting to revive themselves, especially in the red states of America with Republican governors that are up and running. And that's good news. And by the way, they're doing it in a way that's actually keeping people safe and healthy. But what's so interesting about this is that you've got these states now that are up and running, and the businesses are starting to hire again. And we have this strange situation where we have about 35 million people unemployed in the United States, but businesses can't get people back on the job because of stupid government policies that are paying them to stay unemployed.
So, Joseph Stiglitz, do we have to pull the rug then on these job support schemes, or indeed keep them going? I mean, let the market decide.
Oh, let's be clear. The reason people don't want to go